In today's video, we're going to weave a Christmas ornament. So let's get started. These are the Christmas ornament looms you can find in our shop at spruceandlinen.com. They're only available seasonally from now until the beginning of December, so make sure you grab them while you can. Link in the description box below. Today, we're just gonna use the little tree ornament here. So I'm gonna set the other ones aside and we're gonna start warping this little tree loom. The easiest way I find to figure out how much string you need to warp your little ornament loom is like this. I just have a little bit of a tail at one end, and then I'm just gonna bring the string along each of the holes as it goes up. And I know that that's gonna be about halfway, a little more than that. I always go a little bit extra because a few inches of wasted material is better than not having enough and having to start all over again. So I'm gonna cut definitely some extra here. It'll be too much, but that's okay. So then what you're gonna do is you can find a small needle if you have one, or you can just use the string itself. I'm using 4/8 cotton warp string. This is our thinnest warp string, so it's gonna be nice and easy for this. I'm going to bring the string from the back on this corner hole through to the front, and I'm gonna pull that all the way through until I just have a little bit of a tail here. Then I'm gonna go straight up from there and go into that hole. And then before I move on, I'm going to tie this so that the end is secured. So I'm not tying this too tight, and I am going to do a triple knot because sometimes I'm paranoid and it just feels more secure to me. So now we have it secure so we don't have to hold that end anymore, but we're not gonna come over to this hole. We ended here, we're gonna come up to the next hole on the side. So we're gonna come up through there, and then we're gonna go down to the hole that's directly below it. And then we're gonna go beside where we just came up. So we're going up and over, down and over every time. So this one is next. And you don't have to worry about this being super tight right now. We can tighten this later, which is just easier. Right now, I just wanna get this all warped first. So then we ended there. We want to come up through this one and then down, over, and up. And we're just going to repeat that until we're all the way at the other end of the loom. So now I'm completely done warping this. I just need to tie off the end. So you can see I have quite a lot of length. You know, this is probably over a foot of length left. So I could have done this a little bit shorter, but it is nice having some length, so don't worry too much about that. What you can do now, if these are quite loose, you can go back and tighten it up. So I'm gonna start at the end where I tied this, and I'm gonna just start pulling the strings so that I'm tightening them as I go across. I don't want to do this too much because it's gonna make it harder to weave on. So I'm not pulling them super tight, but I want them so that they're not also super loose. We want somewhere in between. This is definitely looser than I would warp on a regular frame loom. Now we need to tie off this end, and how I'm gonna do that, I have a small metal yarn needle, and I'm going to thread my warp string, and then I'm going to grab this loop, which I might have to loosen up at first just to get this through, and then kind of tighten it up. So I have a half knot there, and then I'm going to just tie an overhand knot, making sure that I'm really getting it close to where I tied that half knot. And it's a little bit looser than I intended, but again, that's totally fine. We can kind of spread out some of that slack. Now I'm gonna leave a bit of a tail. I will probably want to tuck this into the weaving later so that it's completely out of the way, so we can just leave the tails there. Now I have some 3mm cotton string, and we're going to be doing a Raya knot, very fringe forward Christmas tree. It's gonna be super cute, and we wanna cut some short pieces so that we can do this. There's a couple different ways you can accomplish this. We can use what is called a Giord's knot, which is when you can do a raya knot, but straight off of your ball of yarn. So I'll show you what that looks like, which is a nice strategy for when you're on these edge strings because they're a little bit tight. So I've just threaded my 3mm onto my yarn needle, and I want to tie my raya knot around these two strings. So I'm gonna go from right to left under the left string. And you can see how much that's quite tight, but we'll get it through. And then from there, I'm going to go from the right to left around the right string as well. Then before I cut this short, I can adjust this so that I'm not wasting too much of my string. I'm gonna leave this bottom row a little bit long so that we can play around with the length later. So then all I need to do is cut that off and we can move on to the next two strings. I'm going to switch to this plastic yarn needle just because it has a bigger eye, so it's gonna be easier for me to get the yarn through it. And I'm gonna do the Giord's knot again. So I'm going on to the next two strings, pulling that through, and then I'm gonna go close to the same length as the other one. Again, not worrying about this being too accurate right now because we're gonna trim it later. Now that I'm more out in the middle, I am just gonna cut a piece and do a regular raya knot. So working around two strings, I'm gonna go from right to left around the right string and from left to right around the left string, and that gives us our raya knot. Pull that down. Again, I'm just gonna leave it long for now. So again, over here, it's a little bit tight, so I'm gonna go do another Giord's knot instead. And we do have an odd amount of strings on this little loom. So what I'm gonna do there is I'm gonna do one more, and I'm gonna grab this string as well as that one. So this time I'm going back to the Giord's knot so that I can have a lot of length to work with. So I'll go around that left string, then around the right. This is gonna be a tight fit, not too bad. And then we'll pull those down and trim. Now we have our first row. So what we're gonna do next is a couple rows of plain weave. We could just do knots all the way up, but it does make for a very, very thick piece. I'm gonna opt for doing plain weave between each row of the knots because this is going to make it so it's less thick by spacing out those knots. So I'm gonna start on this string. I'm actually gonna come up through the bottom so that my end is already in the back for tucking in later. So I'm gonna leave a tail like this in the back. And then I'm just going over one, under one, all the way across. And I do wanna grab this very far string just because we didn't grab it with the knots on that row. And this needle is not going to fit through there. So I'm gonna switch this out for my much thinner needle. The reason I wanna grab that string is just so that it is part of the row and it's gonna be more hidden when we're done. So then I'm gonna go back from there, and I'm just gonna use this metal needle for this since we're working with some tight spaces. And now we have 2 rows of plain weave, and then I'm going to tuck this back in, and we can continue using this later. So I'm gonna just let that long piece hang out, and we're going to tie in more of our raya knots. So you can see that in the previous row, my knot was around these 2 strings, and the one above it is going to be around these 2. So it is a good idea to stagger those knots so that we're really filling out the space the best that we can. And just like we did down here, we're gonna sneak one more knot right in here. This time I am going to unthread the needle because we won't be able to do much more plain weave with that. And we can do more of our raya knots or Giord's knot. So I'm gonna do the Giord's at first, continuing to resort to that when there is a tight space like this. Now, I don't want my knots to stack up on each other. So for this row, I'm actually gonna start on this end. So now that I'm out of the tight spot, I'm gonna go back to just the regular raya knots. This time when I go to do the plain weave, since I realized that we can easily just leave the length in the back when we're doing the knotting rows, I'm gonna take a longer piece so that I don't have to tuck in as many ends. And this time, since the last ones were on the right side, I'm gonna start this plain weave row on the left side, just so that we don't have all our ends to tuck in on one side only. I really don't want to pull in these edge warp strings very much because the idea is to cover as much as the holes as I can. It's not always necessary, but it is something I like to try to do. So once again, staggering the knots so I can see that this knot is on these two strings. So I want to make sure that this first knot is on these two. If I started over here, this knot would end up the same as this one. So that's why I'm going to start on this side. So this row, what I'm noticing is because this knot is sitting so high, what I'm going to do is put my plain weave beside it. I didn't do this on the other rows, but I think it might be a good idea to even out the row when I go back with the second row of plain weave. So now with the second row of plain weave, I am going to go right over top that knot, and then it'll just even out those rows. So I've repeated that same process, staggering the knots, adding the plain weave. So I'm very close to the top now, and I need a little bit more fringe up here. So what I'm gonna do is take this big string that we were using for plain weave and fish it to the back. And I'm actually not gonna do more plain weave. I'm going to add more knots on top of this. I'm going back to the Giord's knot for this since we're working in such a tight area. So I did one on the left side and now I'm doing one on the right side. And I'm gonna try to just slide those up as much as I can. And we will be creating something to cover up this one. So now we're done all the knotting. I'm gonna go to the back and tuck in all the ends. Now this is a little bit tricky. So it's pretty tight back in here. So you definitely wanna use a thinner needle like these metal yarn needles. And I'm just gonna grab some loops that are in the back. These might be plain weave, these might be the raya knots. It doesn't really matter because you're not gonna see it from the front. I'm gonna just try to pull that through. And then I'm gonna trim off the excess. So now I can go ahead and do the same thing with all the other ends. I do have one end that's a little bit on the short side. So what I can do with that one is I can actually fish my needle in first. So I'll find a couple ends here, even 2 is enough. And I'll grab this warp string at the same time, just so we can do them both. Then I'm gonna thread the needle with a little bit of difficulty. And then once that's threaded, now I can pull it through. So that's just a way to deal with ends that you may have left a little bit too short. And now I can trim off the excess. Now that we have all our fringe on here, we need to start trimming it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is make sure that the bottom is straight. And I wanna cut some of these upper ones a little shorter. So I'm just gonna go through and start trimming these a little bit shorter. I'm starting to trim this out. And what I'm doing is grabbing a rope brush and just brushing it a little bit. I don't wanna brush it completely out, but just enough so that it doesn't look like the twisted string anymore. It looks a little bit more separated. And then I can start to trim little pieces. And if we want it to look more like an evergreen tree often looks, where you know it's coming out and then going in a little bit, we can do that by trimming some of the excess a little bit shorter below it. Now, in order to have the stem coming through, if you want it, it would look good either way. You need to trim that bottom quite a bit shorter. But having a little bit of that tree trunk stick out is really cute. Now I'm going around and just randomly cutting little pieces off, so it's almost like giving the tree layers. By going through and trimming these little pieces, it's giving it more texture and more definition on the ends. To fill out the top a little bit better, I do want to add a tree topper to this yet as well. But to fill out that top a bit more, what I'm going to do is take a small piece of string. I'm going to hold on to that little loop I just made and comb this out. And I'm going to go ahead and use hot glue just to place this right up here so that we can fill out more of the top. I want to add some decorations to the tree, and I have these little pom-pom trims that I thought would make great little Christmas ornaments. But I don't really want them on the string, so I'm actually going to go ahead and trim these right off of this edging. So I'm trimming off these little teeny tiny pom-poms, and we'll just make a little pile of them here. And for this trim, this one is a little bit different than the other one. These pom-poms are more integrated into this trim, but I do think I'll be able to just kind of cut them right off. After trying out a bunch of different layouts with the pom-poms, I just wasn't feeling how this looked, so I went back to my white pom-pom trim and cut out a few pieces and decided to lay it out like garland. Since I want this garland to feel like it is indeed hanging from the tree, I'm going to glue each of the ends, but not the middle, so that it'll just sort of hang there by itself. After I finished up the garland, I wanted to make a little bow for a tree topper, so I took 2 strands of 7mm cotton string and I tied a piece of embroidery thread really tight around the center of them, and then I wrapped it around a few times and knotted it again. I took my comb brush and brushed out the ends, and then I started trimming. I kept on trimming this until the bow felt about the right size for the top of my tree, and I absolutely love this quick, easy way to create a bow. To attach the bow, I'm going to add a small dot of hot glue, and I'm going to place this bow perfectly covering up that last hole at the very top that we couldn't quite get all the fringe to. And last but not least, we do need a little hanging string for our ornament. I'm tying the 2 ends together with an overhand knot, and I'm going to place that knot quite close to the ends. Then I'm going to fold it in half and take the looped end, bring it through the top hole of our ornament loom, open up the loop and bring the knot through, and now we have a perfect little hanging string at the top. Our ornament is all done, so let's have a look at the final piece. I love this little tree ornament, and if you liked this video, check out this one next.